at Griffith at any one time, we'd have 15,000 students studying online, an online subject anyway. So I think, and Gary can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've kind of evolved to a point where we have been using technology pretty well to cater for a range of different needs of students. We've had a fairly, I mean, like most universities in Australia, we've had a metropolitan universities anyway, we've had a strong dependence on face-to-face, but coincidentally, the students have voted with their feet now. And so we actually had, in our first semester or trimester, which was when the pandemic hit, we actually had the highest level of student satisfaction, second highest level of student satisfaction we've ever had in terms of the surveys, the evaluation surveys. They realised that obviously we were trying to deal with it as best we could, but they appreciated that they were still able to contribute to their, and successfully contribute to their learning. And that has actually continued into the current semester we're just finishing at the moment, our second trimester, second semester. And again, the student satisfaction level was very high in relation to what the students were able to achieve through the online learning. So to the extent that we only went in our second trimester back to labs only, we haven't gone back to lectures in the physical space. We've only gone back to labs that have to be held in the physical space with appropriate social distancing. And to the great extent, our students are quite appreciative of that. And similar to what was found in the survey, they appreciate the thought of not having to come on campus just to sit, travel for an hour to get to campus, sit in a 2-hour lecture and then travel away again. So there's been some advantages for them, which they've appreciated.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. And this, I just want to ask you one question. One observation is you said we have been prepared, and I think that makes difference, about how this institution respond to this. Some of them were more fortunate because they went to this journey before. But you said on the student satisfaction, was it something that you were running before and you continued during the COVID times, or is it just something that you instituted during COVID?
Well, I think the interesting thing is we were able to upskill our staff very quickly. So we trained in a very short period, like in terms of couple of months, we trained almost 1,000 staff in how to use the technologies they may not have had to use before. So the lecture capture, how to use the lecture capture system if you're working from home as opposed to sitting in front of a lecture theatre, standing in front of a lecture theatre. How we're using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever it might be, Blackboard Collaborate to run online sessions. So we were running literally three professional development sessions a day, each day of the week for about a month. Just to upskill the staff very quickly in relation to working in the online space. And that saw itself out very quickly in terms of the types of activities that were happening in the online space. We also were started to get into the use of Microsoft Teams a lot more in terms of using that student collaboration features within Teams, as opposed to the more structured discussion forums within a learning management system. So that we turned it around a bit to be able to be far more collaborative in terms of the way students were interfacing with each other and with the academic staff. Did we get it all right? No, we didn't. Is it elegant? Not particularly, but we now have a base of staff that are far better trained than they ever have been in relation to using the online tools.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. Anyone else who would like to provide remarks to the survey?
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, thank you. So, like Michael mentioned, NTU certainly is also doing quite well in this particular domain after transitioning into the online teaching. Actually, NTU over the years invested something like $45 million for technology enhanced learning. So that prepared the institution for almost in anticipation of a crisis. So that's not unique. Many universities have been able to do that. What I'm interested in is the survey results. So Anna, let me try to phrase my question. You do see some differences among different regions or among different institutions. Is the digital divide more severe among the rich institutions and the poor institutions, or among different regions? Is there a cultural aspect? This is what the Global Learning Council can contribute, whether the cultural aspect is more prominent or whether it's the institutional background or preparedness is more important.
I think it's deeper than that, actually. I think it's deeper than that. I think there are some very deep cultural concerns in different nations. So, for example, the session I'm going into straight after this, in fact, I have to leave in about 10 minutes.
More 10 minutes break.
Is in relation to what the value of online learning is seen to be. So many nations, some nations, won't say many, some nations class online learning as second rate. So it's not as good as face-to-face learning. And there is a real problem in that. I mean, in Australia, we've been running online learning for 20 years, and it's seen as equivalent to the face-to-face. It's not seen as separate. So on your degree, if you're studying online or studying face-to-face, you wouldn't know. The paperwork doesn't differentiate between it being an online course or a face-to-face course. But in some nations, that it's not that simple. And so they've classed online learning as a second-rate form of learning, which of course it's not. In fact, it can be more advantageous to study online than in face-to-face in some situations. So there is some cultural things that need to be got over fairly to actually progress the equivalency of online learning.
I'd like to jump in on that, thanks, because I think this ties together, you know, the previous two comments tie together exactly what I was thinking, which is that, you know, the presentation was very insightful, but I think it missed out the finance part, which is really important. Like Jimmy said, NTU could put, you know, $45 million into tech-enhanced learning. And NTU is fortunate to be able to do that. HKUST is fortunate to be able to do something similar. We've had instructors who've been, you know, teaching successful MOOCs and so on. And so there is already some knowledge within the institution that can be shared. And so at short notice, exactly like Michael said, you know, many institutions were able to scale up from the instructor side, not such a big problem. But if you've got students around the world, you see basically two things. One is that you may have students whose infrastructure is not up to the standard to capture a streaming Zoom video class. We had a student in India, actually, who spent much of the spring semester stuck at home, could not go out because of the lockdown, and all his classes were held on a mobile hotspot created on his father's phone, simply because the Wi-Fi, you know, the broadband access had dropped and there was nothing he could do about it. And so it's not just about how good of a service you can provide, it's also how good of a service everyone can receive, which is very closely related to the commuting point that Anna had just brought up. You know, a lot of people need to commute an hour and 2 hours, and now they don't have to commute anymore, which is why satisfaction is up. We see that as well. But, you know, our university, you can see it's in a beautiful location, but we do not have easy access. We do not have a subway station. No student wants us to build a subway station. It is not required of the university to invest funds in a subway station, right? So that students can come here. This is just taken for granted. The government will provide this access. But when online, you know, classes go online, it becomes a requirement to enable students to access the classes. But again, I feel, you know, we talked about public-private partnerships. To what extent is the government going to put in the money? We're seeing in the US, where on universities which have been built on, you know, sports stadiums and money from, you know, college football, and on the backs of teaching through adjuncts, that the moment classes go online, people want to pay lower money. They want, and, you know, tuition reductions and so on. One necessary consequence of a tuition reduction is that the university has less money to plow into upgrading the systems and the facilities. So I think a huge part of how successful the long-term transition to online will depend on how much support the governments give the local institutions. Everybody's missing that part out because universities are not existing in isolation. We exist in society. We get money from society. Ours is a public university, and that money enables the services that we can give back to society.
Anirban, can I clarify the point? Are you looking at the government to provide funding because of the income gap that the universities have, or do you think because they have to invest in infrastructure?
I think both, actually. To the extent that the government builds a university in the middle of nowhere, the expectation is on the government to build a road and a bus and a subway station, right? Otherwise, only those people with cars or helicopters will be able to access classes, right? And similarly, I think if education has to be online because there is a pandemic and nobody's allowed to leave the house, who's going to deliver the online access?
Yeah, I sort of agree with Anirban on this point. So it's not the cultural divide, it's the rich and poor divide that determines how effective these new form of educational modality would work. Is that true in your survey?
Let me just jump in. So we don't have enough data to speak of it to say this is representative, the data that we have. So that just right off the bat. The interesting thing is that we had institutions who come from rich countries where students reported that they had food insecurities. 25% of students reported this. Yeah, and I think that is something where if on campus there's a food bank and that it can go and pick up elements, all of a sudden you're in the digital world and they sit at home in a very cramped apartment or house with maybe family, and they are Skyping into classes from their bathroom because that's the only room where they can sit alone. Then yes, whose responsibility is that to provide that environment, that kind of learning setting? Very much agree. It's the government needs to come here at some point and provide also access to data and infrastructure on the technical side. But really, I think the digital divide goes beyond just the technical and the infrastructure in that sense. I think there's more to it than that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. And the other thing is that actually the really interesting point was that the digital divide that participants in our survey spoke of in the open questions and the interviews had a lot to do with maybe a generational digital divide. So they were speaking not of digital divide between students, but of digital divide between instructors and students. They were saying, and this is the lack of expertise among instructors that a lot of people were talking about, is students know how to use these tools. They're more adept at it. It's more natural for them. And for instructors, it's a learning process. And this is where the funding needs to go into instructing the instructors, teaching the trainers how to conduct classes online and giving them input on the pedagogy and what works, because leaving them just to do a Zoom meeting, they'll get through it, but you can do it better probably.
Let's get some perspective. Professor Umanand, you have raised your hand. You want to talk to us? Can you hear us, Professor Umanand? I don't know if you can hear us. Or Professor Fahmy, would you like also? You can hear us?
Oh, it's just Gary. I'd like to just jump in there for a second off that
Gary,
comment.
Please.
Look, from my perspective, working with the students quite closely, what was also interesting was that, for a digital and native student population, there was a significant proportion of students that showed a lack of digital capability and that were quite resistant to the shift to this virtual environment. And that was quite unexpected to us. Yes, the vast majority were quite adaptive, were capable, but there was a significant proportion of students that just didn't cut the mustard in terms of digital learning. So, the question is, how do we get that group of students involved in what is a new norm for education? And I think that's something that's going to be quite challenging. And probably lends itself to a more hybrid learning style where those students have got opportunities to join on campus, where the ones that are more flexible and more capable can be off campus.
That's a very interesting and very surprising. Anirban, please.
I'm sorry, I would like to second what Gary said. Sometimes we tend to paint with too broad a brush. There are some students who strongly prefer the digital classes online, commuting, whatever other reasons, and some people don't. Some professors are really good online, and other people, I've had to coach people how to press play on Zoom, and stuff like that. There's always variations. We found student satisfaction is higher overall, just like Michael said, but for some classes it was better, and for some classes it was worse. Those classes that are more interactive, like the business school case discussions, interactivity goes down online. But the classes that are one-dimensional lectures, people found that much more interactive, because now I'm seeing the professor at a distance of 2 feet on my screen, not at a distance of 30 feet over the backs of 60 different heads. I can chat with other people online in real time. So there are aspects, there are positives and there are negatives. But overall, I think, and maybe this is not true in Australia, but I do feel as if people generally don't want to pay as much for online. They devalue anything that's online. They don't want to pay as much for an ebook as they would for the regular book. This is an example I use in class all the time. And when you push them to, they don't really know why. They want the option of the online classes, but they will not attend class. They will come to campus and hang out with their friends, right? So, and there are students who, even when they had to attend class from their bathroom, and there are cases, they actually are thankful for that opportunity. In the middle of the craziness that's gone on in 2020, here is something that I can relate to, So there's all of these other factors as well. If you give them a welcoming environment where they feel they're getting something to learn, then yeah, they will come back and they will engage. It's just a question of figuring out how to make that work for everyone, or for most of the people, most of the time.
Thank you for that.
I might have a question to Michael, and it's quite interesting to see how things are going on for a long time in Australia, because you are not densely populated like we are in Europe, at the one hand, and at the other hand, you might have much more refined your digital systems or online training, and from that, it's probably not a case of the culture, but the case of a refined technology or refined technology and didactic, that this is not second-rate kind of teaching. And one aspect which caused a certain rethinking in my head was one more time listening to the medicine people. And one saying is, things will never come back as it has been before. Most of the time, and it's my head, whenever the pandemic situation is improving, we have the vaccine, we come back to things as they have been before. If this is not true, that everything is as before, what does it mean to the long-term effects, the long-term planning we do? Even in Australia, I remember from my sabbaticals at the University of Sydney, you have hundreds of students running across a campus most of the time. So this is not taking place at the same time. And additionally, for Australia, unlike, say, for example, Germany, university education is a sort of income. It's not the income in Europe. And if people are not willing to pay as much for online training, or not coming to the university because it's offered online, so what is the long-term planning in that case, that we would assume things are changing and they will never be the same as before the pandemic? I don't know if this is the kind of thinking in Australia, for example, because of Because in Australia, it's the hybrid education, of course, too. You have the on-campus aspect and you have the online aspect. Do we really plan in a way that things are changing and never will be the same as before?
Friedrich, let me catch you here. Unfortunately, we'd like to go back to the schedule, but I would like to invite someone who hasn't spoken already, Professor Zita Moht Fahmi, if you would like to talk, or Professor Umanand.
I would like to offer my view. I was shortly out and then came in because of lack of connectivity. So that is one of the problems which the students face. See, before the pandemic, we had online MOOCs online, lots of MOOCs online prevalent. But after the pandemic, one of the main constraints is that it became mandatory for everybody. And that mandatoriness was a big problem in the sense that there was no choice for the students or for the instructors. And because of that, there were pluses and minuses. Of course, they could maintain social distancing, but from the point of view of academic streamlining, there were issues in the sense that it became more like a one-way dialogue. The students couldn't respond. Okay, you could type and then you could chat, but that is not all. But especially if you're talking of engineering subjects, you need to discuss by writing because there will be a lot of maths to write. So we can't type that. So what is the means to write? So it must be a writing pad, or you have to have some kind of mechanism where you write on paper and then stream it. These are again technological issues which the students couldn't handle. Plus, of course, already Anirban and others have mentioned on connectivity. Internet connectivity is not available at all the remote areas because the students come from all over the place. Urban students have no issues, but the problems are with the rural students in rural locations. So these were some of the major bottlenecks when we had the last semester, that is the one ending in June. We had it totally online, and the one that is ongoing semester is also totally online. There are 350 courses, so there is no choice for the students, and because of that, these issues are coming up. There is no kind of discussion with the teacher for the student, especially. Active discussion. It is offline and through emails and through chats, but then the effect is not as good as the student just directly writing and asking a question, and the teacher replying back. Because this discussion may need other apparatus like a tablet, like a pen, which they cannot afford. So these are some of the issues which we are trying to face. Yeah, I will stop now at this point.
Thank you for that. And in order us to stick as much to the schedule with a smaller delays, thank you for this animated conversation.